African leaders aren't following power, they're following Ibrahim Traoré. Hello everyone and welcome back. Why are more and more African leaders, quietly, steadily, looking toward Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso? Not for speeches at international summits, not for military alliances, but for something deeper. From the outside, many observers assume Traoré's influence comes from confrontation or defiance. But that explanation misses the real story. The reason African leaders listen to him has far less to do with power plays and far more to do with ideas. In a recent address focused on education and youth, Traoré laid out a vision that explains his growing appeal. A vision built on discipline, production, scientific knowledge, and mental sovereignty. No slogans, no theatrics, just a hard question Africa has avoided for decades. Why do we consume what we could produce? Why do we train elites to leave instead of to build? And why has development been discussed more than practiced? Tonight, we unpack the real reason African leaders are paying attention. Stay with me. Dear friends, to understand why Ibrahim Traoré has become a reference point for African leadership, we have to move past headlines and focus on substance. His influence does not come from charisma alone. It comes from coherence. At the center of Traoré's worldview is a simple but uncomfortable premise. No nation can be sovereign if it does not produce. And production, in his view, begins not with trade deals or foreign aid, but with education. Specifically, the kind of education a country prioritizes. In his address, Traoré did not celebrate academic success as an end in itself. He treated it as a responsibility. Diplomas, he argued, are only meaningful if they translate into capability, into engineers who can build, scientists who can test, technicians who can manufacture, and citizens who can solve real problems. This is where many African leaders recognize themselves in his message. For decades, African education systems have excelled at producing certificates while importing nearly everything else. Countries export raw materials, import finished goods, and import even the most basic items: bicycles, buttons, tools, machinery. Traoré does not frame this as bad luck or lack of intelligence. He frames it as a design flaw. You cannot industrialize, he suggests, if you train consumers instead of producers. This is why he places such emphasis on scientific education. Not because literature, history, or law are unimportant, he explicitly acknowledges their value, but because science and engineering are the backbone of health systems, infrastructure, agriculture, and industry. Without them, sovereignty remains symbolic. This logic resonates with leaders facing the same structural bottlenecks. They know that speeches about independence mean little if food, energy, medicine, and machines must still be imported. Traoré offers a diagnosis that feels honest, and a prescription that feels practical. But education, in his framework, is not just about subjects. It is about mindset. Traoré repeatedly returns to what he calls mental distraction. He warns that imperial influence today is not only military or economic, it is psychological. Algorithms, entertainment loops, and constant stimulation keep young minds busy but unproductive. Pleasure replaces focus. Consumption replaces creation. This is where his message becomes controversial, and precisely why it draws attention. He argues that societies that dominate global production do not feed their children the same digital diet consumed elsewhere. Their children are pushed toward building, experimenting, inventing. Others are encouraged to scroll, watch, and admire. The result is not inferiority of intelligence, but misdirection of attention. For many African leaders, this rings uncomfortably true. They see talented youth spending years online with little connection to local industry or innovation. They see graduates trained to seek opportunities abroad rather than to build at home. They see brain drain framed as personal success, while national capacity weakens. Traoré challenges this narrative directly. He tells students that studying abroad is not the problem, not returning is. Patriotism, in his definition, is not rhetoric, it is service. If knowledge leaves permanently, development cannot follow. This stance has struck a chord with leaders struggling to retain skilled professionals. Traoré does not blame individuals alone. He acknowledges that past governments failed to create conditions worth returning to, but he insists that this cannot remain an excuse. No one will rebuild a country from the outside. Another reason leaders listen to Traoré is his rejection of credentialism. He openly questions systems that prioritize CVs over competence. What matters, he says, is not what you studied, but what you can do. What can you build? What can you repair? What can you produce? This is a radical shift for bureaucratic systems inherited from colonial administration, where paperwork often mattered more than output. Leaders across Africa understand the cost of this mismatch. Projects that look good on paper, but fail in reality. Traoré's solution is unapologetically practical. He speaks of laboratories instead of lecture notes, workshops instead of diagrams, incubators for inventors who never went to university but can create with their hands and minds. This is not abstract theory. It is an attempt to re-anchor development in production. Equally important is his focus on early childhood education. Traoré argues that curiosity and scientific thinking must begin at ages 3 to 5. If that foundation is missed, later reforms struggle. Many African leaders recognize this as the missing link in decades of reform efforts that focused on universities while neglecting the base. What makes Traoré's message especially influential is its moral clarity. He does not promise quick wealth. He does not flatter youth. He demands discipline, focus, and sacrifice. He tells teachers to teach patriotism alongside mathematics. He tells parents to limit distractions. He tells students that creation, not comfort, is the path forward. In an era of populist politics, this is unusual, and that is precisely why it stands out. Leaders facing restless populations know that promises alone no longer convince. Traoré offers a framework that explains hardship without glorifying it, and connects sacrifice to a tangible outcome. Finally, his concept of endogenous development ties everything together. Development must come from within, not because cooperation is bad, but because dependency is fragile. A country that cannot manufacture its own basics cannot negotiate as an equal. This idea is not new, but Traoré articulates it with a coherence that many leaders find refreshing. It is not anti-world, it is pro-capability. That is the real reason African leaders follow him, not because he shouts the loudest, not because he defies the most, but because he offers a model that answers a question they all face. How do we turn independence into capacity? So the rise of Ibrahim Traoré is not a mystery. It is a response to decades of development that talked more than it built. A response to education systems that certified more than they created. A response to sovereignty that existed on paper but not in production. African leaders are watching Traoré because he is not selling rebellion. He is selling responsibility to produce, to focus, to return, and to build. Whether his model succeeds will depend on execution. But the reason it resonates is already clear. For the first time in a long time, an African leader is asking the right question out loud. What can we make with our own hands? And that question is quietly changing the conversation. Thank you for watching.